Wow.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive here in South Florida in Fort Lauderdale. It is a very wet and damp day here, but thankfully we don't have all of the ice and rain that I understand 100 million people in the United States have right now. And so for all of my friends in New York and New England who are still up there, it's nice and warm down here. Just keep on remembering that, because it does work well. We probably don't like our governor or our senators as much as you do there, but they're prices that we have to pay. But anyway, welcome to the next hour, and we're going to be talking about Studio One. And just so everybody knows, this of course is being recorded and it will be archived on our website. And to our friends on Facebook, we're live on Facebook now. And so hello everybody on Facebook. You can like us at Stonewall National Museum and Archive as well too. And let's say hello to our two guests here, Marc Saltarelli and Lloyd Coleman. Marc, let's start with you. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm here in sunny LA. It's 70 degrees. Don't mean to rub it in, but another perfect day here.
Exactly right. Well, of course, Southern California is wonderful. And of course, it's great in the winter there as well. Let's say hi to Lloyd. Hi, Lloyd.
Hi there. How you doing, everybody? And I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. And it's kind of chilly here. It's just about the 60-degree mark. So I guess we're not as bad as Texas, but we're not as warm as California right now. Usually it's quite warm this time around, but it's kind of chilly. Glad to be here, though.
Well, and of course, we're great to have you here. And just for the two of you, just so you know, there is a little tiny delay here. And so just know that when you speak and when you finish speaking, I'm sorry, I probably should have said this earlier, but whoever the yellow box is around is the one who people can see that image. So it's up to us to try to make sure. Of course, we don't do it perfectly, but it's up to us to try to make that happen. I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Emery Grant, who's behind the scenes here. Emery, say hello.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Nice to see you, and thank you, Emery, for all the work that you do to make these things happen. If you're new to Stonewall, let me just tell everybody that Stonewall has been around for 47 years. We're located here in South Florida. Interestingly, we have almost nothing to do with the Stonewall riots in New York. We got that name in 1973 simply as a way of describing gay rights at that time. It was only 4 years after the Stonewall riots. And it was founded by a gentleman who was living in Hollywood, Florida at the time, who actually had one shelf of his bookcase about this big. He was in his early 20s, and he was collecting gay-themed books. And his idea was that he wanted to call them Stonewall because there he was in South Florida at the time, and he heard about this insurrection about gay rights, and he was going to start, with his parents' support, putting together a small library of gay books. Well, that effort that started 47 years ago, we now have 28,000 books about gay history. Fiction, non-fiction, biography, art books, huge music collection. And then, of course, gays being the way they are, we save a lot of stuff. And so we have an archive as well, too. In the archive, we have 2,700 linear feet. And what that amounts to, imagine going all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and down the other. And our best guess is it equals about 6 million pages of gay history, mostly from 1950 to the present day, although we certainly have objects from the 19th century as well, too. So if you're in South Florida, certainly come and visit us. We have all the COVID precautions in place, and we're open 6 days a week. We've been open actually to the public since July. And we've been doing these talks every week. There are now over 12,000 people have attended one of these talks. And so I just want to thank Lloyd and Marc for joining us here, because it really is a very important part of what we do as far as being able to present and preserve queer history. You can find out everything about us through stonewall-museum.org. And you can even sign up for a weekly newsletter there, so you can find out what you want to do and participate in. And I promise we won't ask you for money too many times, but like any nonprofit, it's the world that we live in. And so you can always say no. But one thing that I will say is, though, even if you don't want to make a contribution, it's very important for you to box up all of your gay stuff and send it to us. Let us throw that stuff away. Don't you throw it away. If it has anything to do with American gay history, whether they're serials or publications, send them to us and let us determine whether or not there's historic value or it's going to fill out a collection in a particular way. And also, if you're in other parts of the country, there may be a gay archive near you. And if things are particularly local and regional, you may want to donate it to that gay archive. Because again, it's very important for this history to be preserved. One last thing I want to say is that we do exhibitions, of course, at Stonewall. Last week, we opened a show called Off Our Backs, Early Lesbian Publications. Megan Kent, who is the chief curator at the Hollywood Center for Arts and Culture here in South Florida, was the curator on that show. And you can see the virtual curators talk on our website. And we'll actually be putting up an online version of that exhibition probably by the end of this week. And then next week, we're opening an exhibition called The Saint. And that is based upon the discotheque in New York, which ran from 1981 to 1988. They started doing installation work on that today. I'm very excited about that show. And it's really because The Saint was something that, so this show is going to have original posters and ephemera from our archive from The Saint. And so in the course of my conversations, I started speaking to Marc, and I thought, what a wonderful thing to talk about Studio One while we were getting ready to have the Saint exhibition up. And so I think it makes total sense. And these guys have been working hard on putting together a film. We're going to hear about that as well, too. And there'll be an opportunity for people to support that film. And I know I'm going to, and I hope other people do as well. So in just one last little piece of housekeeping, we tend to keep the last 15 minutes for questions, but feel free to put them in at any time, put them in under the chat or the Q&A portion of this talk, and we'll get to them as we go along. And so feel free to do that, and of course, share it with whomever that you'd like to. So we have both Marc and Lloyd here, and so for all of us, set the scene. Studio One was a disco. I've read that it touted itself as the first gay disco in the United States. And it was at a period of time in 1974 that there was only a very small minority of bars and clubs in the United States were actually legal, because many of them were controlled by organized crime, simply because it was illegal to have gay bars out there. And so they had the propensity to be raided whenever local police departments wanted to raid them at that time. But maybe Lloyd, I don't know if you want to start here, but sort of paint for us the picture. What was going on in the 1970s in Los Angeles, in West Hollywood, in Santa Monica? What was it like? You might not have been there, certainly at all at that time, but certainly you came by 1978, so you had a good sense about it. But what was that like?
Well, I actually had my first trip to West Hollywood in 1976, and the first place I sought out as a young, very closeted gay man was Studio One. I had heard about it on, I don't know if you remember Tom Snyder and who's the other guy married? Oh my God, the white-haired guy, Donahue. They both
Phil Donahue.
Yeah, they both did shows on this discotheque that opened up, highly controversial, where men danced together. And I was going to university, just finishing up at BYU, and of course, Brigham Young University. I did not know who and what I was, but it really rang a bell with me. So when I got to California, it was the first place I sought out. And everything was sort of centered in LA around Santa Monica Boulevard. One end, you had the smaller clubs, and as you got towards the other end of Santa Monica, the clubs seemed to get bigger and bigger. It may have been because if you did a pub crawl, you'd start at one end and you end up in this big, giant tub of people, this human soup of the most gorgeous gay men you'd ever seen in your life, in this building, in this factory that sit at the very end of the boulevard. Everything was still, though, in 1976, still a secret. People went in with their eyes kind of looking behind them to make sure that no one followed them in or they didn't see anybody they knew. But you would get to Studio One, and you would pay your money to go in the door, and you'd walk up the stairs. And I mean, we say this in the film. I think everybody who's ever been to Studio One recalls this very same thing. You walk up the stairs, and the closer every step you got, the thunder of the stomping of the feet on the dance floor up ahead would get louder, and the music would get louder. And it was, at that time, severe disco. You would get up to the top of the stairs, and it was just packed with shirtless men, monitors, not like we know monitors today, flat screen. These were TV monitors, literally TVs all over the place, hanging in the air, showing pictures of the night before, the men who came the night before. You know, those days you couldn't take a picture, and you couldn't take a phone. We didn't have phones and cameras. You couldn't take a picture and take a picture. But they had Studio One in-house photographers taking pictures of the most beautiful people on the dance floor. And you would stop there and you'd look up, and you felt like, wow, I'm normal. You know, like I fit all these like normal looking men. You know, stereotypes were everything in the 70s. You know, people like to put labels on you. But you get into Studio One and you just saw beautiful young men, and you felt normal about it. And then the closer you would go in from the bar and into the dance floor, and then it was just pounding. It was like a rave. And there were like 3 rings around the room. There was a steady stream of people going clockwise. You go in the room and you go clockwise, and you'd walk down past everybody, and everybody in the room would watch you walking past. Then there was an inner circle, and people are dancing. And then there was a circle inside of that, and it was people with flags and doing all of their stuff. And then they had stages all around the room, and there would be go-go boys dancing. And you just couldn't take your eyes off the other people in the room. It was heaven for the very first time. And it was that way from the very first time I walked in there to the very last time I ever experienced the room, which was, we did a return to Studio One just a year ago. We had a special farewell party to the building. It was the same way. We walked in, it's the same feeling again. That building lent itself to amazing energy. You know,
So you say there was a farewell party to the building. So has the building since been taken down?
The building's been dismantled, but it's being rebuilt. Part of how we all got together, Marc and I, and everyone, was in preserving the history of Studio One. We fought as a community to keep the building from being demolished by the developers who bought the property several years ago. They were going to just demolish it and put a 5-star hotel up. But through community outreach and community, I don't want to say backlash, but through community involvement and the city of West Hollywood, and thank goodness this wonderful mayor, we had John Duran and his friends in there, were all part of the Studio One experience of the 70s and 80s, helped us to collectively preserve the building, even though they had to dismantle it and put it into their new hotel the right way. The building is actually going to be rebuilt, and it will survive as a banquet and dance hall. Part of it will be a museum with the One Archives are going to have a small, we don't know what it is yet as far as space, but they're going to have a museum to the building Studio One itself, and they're retaining the Studio One entrance awning. And it will be on, so it's just literally picked up the building up, they polished it off, put it back together. It was a factory with, it's made of bronze and other metals. And you could put it together like a Tinker Toy. The factory was designed to be torn apart and put together again. And so they've just rebuilt it and they've repurposed it. And we've saved our building in a sense. Why we couldn't save exactly the way it was, we've preserved the building for all time, you know, or until someone comes along 40 years from now and decides to demolish it again. But it will have a museum in it to Studio One.
That's great. It's an important part of the stories. And of course, there are many gay and AIDS monuments and memorials out there, and so it's important for it to appear on that list. Marc, you're a filmmaker by training?
I am, right?
That's right. And
on this subject, the film structure basically is the present day Save the Factory storyline, and that kind of carries the film through. It's really an important part of the film.
Sure. Well, let me ask you, one of the things, I know you've done a lot of research and working on the film, and of course, Lloyd just told us a wonderful firsthand experience of what it was like being in that space. So tell us a little bit about how the space really happened in 1974. And I've read that there was a gay optometrist, Scott Forbes, who had the vision to do it. But what have you uncovered? What have you learned about what was the vision and what was behind putting this space together?
Yeah, well, Lloyd touched on it a bit, but before 1974, gay bars were shuttered and kind of sneaked into a back entrance. And the reason that they all developed around West Hollywood is because that was an unincorporated area and it was out of the LAPD jurisdiction. LAPD would come in and just beat people up and throw them in the paddy wagon. West Hollywood sheriffs were a little bit kinder, but they still did have abuse going on. So Scott Forbes wanted to change that. And it's been said that he created the first open bar, meaning that when you went to Studio One, if you wanted to get in, you had to wait in a long line outside. And people would wait proudly, not be ashamed. They may have bottles thrown at them, but they were there and they were proud to be there. And so Scott Forbes really, his vision, not only being an optometrist, he had a perfect vision for making the first kind of gay Disneyland, if you will, for gays, by gay. But he also didn't allow people of color generally in. That was kind of a scandal. Who you'll see in the clip later, Dr. Don Kilhefner, was one of the people in the documentary that talks about how Studio One was racist and sexist. They didn't like women. There was the famous open-toed shoes policy that Scott made. And, of course, all women back then had open-toed shoes when they'd come and they would turn them away for that. If you were African-American, they would ask for 2 forms of ID. And if you had 2, well, then now you have to have 3 forms of ID. If you had 3, like a passport, then they would bring a manager out. I mean, it was that bad from the stories I've been told. People picketed outside. Supposedly they cleaned it up a bit by the 80s, but oddly enough, Scott had several partners, Michael Solomon one, but one of them was a black man, Ernie Carruthers. He was a silent partner.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an important and regrettable part of so many of these stories. And of course, we can't. It's hard to imagine in 2021 any of us being involved in a situation in which racial or gender discrimination would be a part of it. But it is something that today in 2021 we just have to acknowledge. The facts were what the facts were, and that we're not pointing fingers at anybody. We're just simply trying to record the history and state the history properly. Marc, I think you have a number of clips for us, and this might be a good time that maybe we could start out with the trailer of the film, simply because it's going to give us an overview and allow us to get into some of this. And so I don't know who's going to be doing that. Emery, it looks like you. So let's go ahead and play that trailer.
Okay, guys, used to be paradise.
It was an explosion, a complete immersion.
I never thought there would be a place for me to be myself.
Studio!
Anybody who tells you that they were there in the 70s and remembers it wasn't there.
You were in the middle of a group of the most beautiful men you've ever seen.
You could feel the energy move throughout the whole room.
When you crossed over into the threshold of the dance floor was a kind of alternative reality.
That was really my entrance into life. I was wide-eyed. It was Hollywood.
Opening night, you had 1,500 people, and the turntable would jump. I said to Scott, call RCA, get someone down here to fix that damn turntable.
There were hundreds of people, everybody who was anybody, especially in the gay community, showed up.
We did a record promotion to hundreds of shirtless, sweaty, beautiful men.
Studio One was always about the backlot. It was the major place to
And all of a sudden, I looked over and I see Cary Grant walk through the doors. Oh my God, it's Cary Grant.
I remember seeing Betty Davis. To see Rock Hudson, I thought, wow, this whole place was packed with celebrities. Women had to have 3 pieces of ID.
Open-toed shoes were not allowed.
There was discrimination against blacks.
Protests began almost immediately. Protests were broad range.
People just were slipping away, and I was singing at all these memorial services.
The fact that they made the decision to bring me with them the night of the fundraiser, if something's going to happen and the place is going to get blown up, at least we're all there together.
He used to always say to me, "Don't tell me there's not a war on."
I've only loved 3 people in my life, and he was one of them. Love the shot. It really captured him.
I see all of these people that I used to dance with at the clubs who are now deceased. But this is 30 years later, and I still get very emotional about it.
West Hollywood lost 10,000 people, and their spirits are still here because this was the place where they were happiest. God bless Studio One forever.
It's such a wonderful clip, and you know, you guys have done such a great job so far. And a question has been posed about how people can support the film, and we'll be getting to all of that stuff as well too. Emery, if you get a moment, be sure you can throw the link in there so that people can see that, and we'll be talking about that as well. Lloyd, I know you're involved with the project, and of course, as we were saying before, any recitation of history is it's got a certain amount of truth and a certain amount of memory in it. But when you look at that clip again, I'm sure you've seen it 100 times. You know, how does it reflect back on your 20-something-year-old self, fresh out of Brigham Young University? I don't imagine Brigham Young had a great gay-straight alliance there.
There was no such thing. As a matter of fact, I was actually accused while I was at Brigham Young. I was in a big singing group. It was a rather famous singing group. And so I wrote a song, and apparently the song had love overtones. I'll get to your question in just a second. But what do they call, the resident assistants in the dorm room pulled me aside, and then I had to meet with the BYU standards people. They came out and said, "Are you homosexual? You wrote a love song to your friend." And you know, actually at that point in time, I knew deep down inside, yes, I knew, but I had never acted on my sexuality ever, not until I actually came to Southern California. So, no, nothing at BYU ever occurred. I never participated. But when I watched this project, every time I will go right back to the time, the very first moment I walked into Studio One. It's a moment I'll never forget, and it's a feeling that overwhelms you. I don't even know how to say it, but you would get that feeling every time you went to Studio One. John Duran, who's in our program, who was the speaker there, the last one on stage, made a comment and makes a comment in the film. And he talks about how we would line up down the block. We'd risk having stuff thrown at us because we never knew who we were going to meet. We'd never know what we could experience, but we cherished those. We went there with such, like, you know, the butterflies in your stomach, like, who are you going to meet? Who are you going to end up with? I met the love of my life there. That is true. The true love of my life I met there. It was everything. And it was like, I don't want to say everything to everyone. There was something for everyone in that building. And it was a sense of community I'd never felt, and to this day have never felt in a community setting like a bar. It was such a strong community. And Scott Forbes, who built the place, he treasured that. He tapped into it. We often talk about politicians that tap into a segment of the population and they know exactly what buttons to push. Scott Forbes tapped into the young gay male coming out, coming of age, and provided everything we needed as people. So it was, you couldn't go out at night on a weekend in West Hollywood if you lived there and not go to Studio One. It was that important. You would have the sense of fulfillment, I guess is the best way to say it. You'd come away from there. I never came away from there drunk. Well, maybe not. It was not a regular thing to come away from there drunk, but I would be completely inebriated with the experiences of every night I went there. There was just something to talk about for the whole week long. You know, you'd either see a celebrity or you'd be a part of something. I mean, we watched Dynasty, the TV show Dynasty, as a community on Wednesday nights with 1,000 other people sitting on the dance floor watching Dynasty. Stuff like that happened for the community. It was just a community gathering place that historically I don't think exists anywhere in the world, has existed ever.
Sure. No, and it's, and these things are such pivotal things in different groups and societal lives, and so it's really important. Now, I don't know if you said it, but just repeat it. We heard about the building, the buildings in current intended use and how that's going to happen. But what was the building built for originally? Do you know?
Yes, Mark, you want to take it? You want to answer that? Okay, it's it was first built as the Mitchell Camera Factory in the turn of the century, 1900s. And the last cameras, I mean, if you were a Hollywood filmmaker, your cameras came from, this was before Kodak and Panavision, your cameras came from the Hollywood Mitchell Camera Factory on Robertson Boulevard. It was this factory. And the last cameras to be built there were the ones used on Gone with the Wind. And yeah, it was the very last, and Gone with the Wind was the first big cinema extravaganza, what do they call it, Panavision, but it was a major technological event with the cameras used in Gone with the Wind. It was in color, it was widescreen, and they were made there at the Mitchell Camera Factory. So the building started out as a factory, was used for that. I understand during wartime, and I don't know what it was used for, but when the World War II happened, it was used for some sort of manufacturing of something in there. People have told me it was used for ammunitions. I heard it was made for uniforms, but the act, the national act that commandeers buildings or whatever, they took the building over for a little while, and they did manufacture supplies for World War II. And then in the 50s and 60s, it reverted to factorial use. I know a couple of gyms. Mark, do you have
actually in the 50s and 60s, it became several variations of a nightclub.
Right.
In fact, some of the members of the Rat Pack owned it at a certain period of time. An interesting story is that Scott Forbes met his first partner at what it was before it was Studio One. And they decided at that moment in that building that they would create Studio One.
Great. No, and of course, it's always important to understand sort of the history of these repurposed buildings. And of course, that life is an important life of it. So then also there was part of Studio One, which was known as the back lot. And I know, Lloyd, that you worked there for a period of time, but maybe Mark, I'm going to ask you, tell us, set this up. We saw some of those scenes, but set this up as to what the back lot was. And from my understanding, it was sort of adjacent to or annexed to
it was part of the same building. Part of the same building. It originally opened as Studio One, the disco. And shortly after that, Scott decided that this whole back area, wasn't really being used, and he wanted to make some money. So he decided to create a nightclub. He made it a little bit different than the ones that were there before. Michael Solomon lays claim to naming it the back lot because, of course, what studio doesn't have a back lot? So it kind of started slowly. But then Liza Minnelli and her father, Vincent Minnelli, went to meet with Scott Forbes. And the musical Chicago was being produced and it was on hiatus. It hadn't yet been on Broadway. And so they had a long period of time where the actors weren't doing anything. And Liza was, of course, good friends with Cheetah. They went, and Cheetah's dad, of course, loved old Hollywood history, and he wanted to go and see the backlot. And so the two of them said, Scott, can you book Cheetah Rivera? And that is kind of what set the whole thing off, and it became a sensation.
Overnight.
It was overnight. It was booked solid. I think she did 1 or 2 weeks. I'm not sure exactly. And then everybody who's anybody wanted to perform there, and so many people had introductions by their famous friends. Like Betty Davis would introduce. Who was she with in Dark Victory? Geraldine Fitzgerald, right? It's all of the celebrities of the early 70s, you know, from old Hollywood would start going there, from Cary Grant to Doris Day, to whoever you can think of, they went there. And the amazing thing is that it was kind of the first integration of straight Hollywood or acting straight Hollywood and the gay community, because oftentimes after seeing a show, some of the big stars would go and have a dance afterward.
It actually had a lot to do also with, you know, you've heard it said that celebrities will test things out on a gay audience, because if it passes a gay audience, they know it creatively, they've hit a home run. And the backlot, you could go see not only a celebrity on stage, but quite often the celebrity's best friends. We produced Estelle Reiner, for example, night at Carl Reiner's wife. Now, Carl Reiner's world in Hollywood is everybody who's ever been anybody to anyone, and they all came to see Estelle Reiner. So you see Mel Brooks, Anne Bancroft, you name the, you know, Billy Crystal. That would be any night, any given night at the Studio One Backlot Theater. Rosalind Kind would be performing on stage, and her sister Barbara Streisand would be in the audience. This was a typical night at the Studio One Backlot. As well as on the dance floor, you could walk in and see somebody like Cher or Elton John roaming the dance floor. It had a celebrity attraction where celebrities would go and just feel them like themselves. They'd let their hair down. There was no paparazzi. They would go in there, and the gay community embraced them, and they embraced the gay community, and there was no labels. There were no labels. It was, we all knew we were in a gay bar, but you didn't have to be gay to be there. So why, you'd never get labeled being gay going there. And that had its own attraction for closeted people like myself. It was one of the biggest reasons I would go. But for the studio people and the workers of Hollywood would go to Studio One and feel absolutely comfortable, because everybody knew everybody would go there. You didn't have to be straight or gay. And that was the beauty of it. And as is mentioned several times in the film, and we discussed this part, that was the joy of Studio One, and the celebrity. And you really felt like you're somebody when you're out there. You're seeing these people. It was so normal to be next to celebrities.
And it's so interesting to think about, just from a club standpoint, in the sense that there were definitely these two different areas, in the sense you had giant, amazing disco with amazing lights, amazing music, and as you describe, all these beautiful people. Yeah. And then you also had sort of the dinner theater, or the dinner club thing, which there were real performances, and people could sit down. They could probably order expensive champagne if they wanted to, or maybe a little bite to eat if they wanted to, or something like that. And so it created those, and I suspect, as you were describing, if I'm correct here, that many people would go to the dinner club part, and then end up in the dance floor afterwards.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened. And it was the traffic went both ways. And there's another piece. There was a third bar in between those bars. And then if you didn't like any of that action, there was a basement bar called the Rose Tattoo. It was not an affiliate of Studio One, but all the performers would play upstairs or downstairs, the Rose Tattoo and the Backlot Theater. Those were the two biggest stages for that audience, for that a Broadway audience, an audience of, like I say, cabaret entertainers, big famous cabaret entertainers. But you had two main stages, upstairs and downstairs.
Yep.
Yeah, but, the disco for most performers was going on. Sometimes the beating, of the disco would bleed in, but some performers didn't want the disco to happen when they were performing. Like Elsa Lanchester was particularly homophobic. You may remember her from Bride of Frankenstein. And when she played the backlot, she closed the disco because she didn't want those gays in there. Interesting.
Yeah.
So
And wasn't she married? Wasn't she married to a gay man?
I don't know.
Somebody.
She didn't want the disco. That's for sure.
Well, somebody needs to look that up.
No, not that I've heard of.
Well, Charles Lawton. Anyway, let's also sort of move. There we go. Let's.
Maybe it wasn't homophobic, but she didn't want the disco going on.
That was a noise. Yeah.
Well, yes, but the thing is too. Maybe it was an unsuccessful relationship for her as well too. So it's. We don't need to go down that path.
We'll go.
But anyway, so Lloyd, you actually worked in Studio One as a producer
Yes.
from '83 to '88, and so just give us a little sense of what you were doing there at the time.
Well, I got into there was Studio One had an in-house producer named Phyllis Teitler. Phyllis Teitler's sister was Jane Oliver. You may remember Jane Oliver is quite a gay icon in the early '80s, late '70s. But for some reason, there was a falling out with Studio One, and the shows were at risk because the person that handled all the bookings there was leaving. I caught wind of it, and I quickly formed a production company without knowing anything, but I knew I wanted to do this. Stormed in there one day, barnstormed Scott Forbes and Ernie Carruthers, sort of caught them in between the office and the disco and said, I'd like to make a proposal to you to take over this production. Sometimes things just fall into place because they're supposed to happen, and that's what happened. Within a week, we had done a contract with Scott Forbes, and my company, Rocket Entertainment, suddenly became the production company for the Backlot Theater. For me, it was such a blessing and a coup. And because with it came all the entertainers from the past with the building. There were people who had an annual show there. There were people who had been hearing about this place since 1975, 76, since Chita Rivera opened her show there. So we got everybody that wanted to do a show in Hollywood, wanted to do something at Studio One, and they got to go through our company. And we grew as producers. We got to learn the business, if you will, with the very best. And though we had to learn fast, we were three creative people. My partners and I were three very creative people. And to this day, we have a love relationship still with most everybody we ever worked with. There was never any bad moment. I can't even think of a bad moment. Not one.
And
one bad moment.
Lloyd and Gary Steinberg, who is the love of your life. They're not partners anymore, but back then they were, and they were these do-it-yourself producers going around, making the posters themselves, putting them on telephone poles all over the city, as Lloyd says. And these two guys are two of the main characters in the film that kind of we follow throughout. And of course, Lloyd and Gary were instrumental in getting the final evening with Faring, the developer, planned, and in really saving the factory, right? In fact, Gary Steinberg, his best friend, he's a straight guy, but his kids call Gary Uncle Gary, works for Faring, and the whole idea kind of was hatched at a cocktail party, and the rest is history.
So we have a question here for you specifically, Lloyd, about the idea to ever work with a lighting designer at studio, Steve Howell. Does that ring a bell? You don't have to tell any tales out of school. So
No. Actually, the sound and lighting people that I worked with, John Winkler, and he went by the name Bobby McClure, were the in-house people, but there were also lighting people that were in the front of the house, Studio One, and there were a lot of shows done on the Studio One side, like Mary Wilson, who we just lost a couple yeah, was it 2 weeks already?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Mary Wilson, but major celebrities doing record releases would have lighting tech people in there, but we never crossed paths. We were strictly the shows, and then some show people or some shows that came in requested certain sound and light people, and
Sure.
then that would not go through us. But no, I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a straight question.
Ron Hamill was
Ron Hamill.
for many years. He's a part of our film. And just so you have an idea, there was the front bar, the disco, and then there was kind of a curtained area, you know, that people would be from the disco to the backlight. And oftentimes you would find people making out back there. It was sort of a place for that. And the reason I'm saying that is because I do want to get one clip in of Michael Koth, who is a major part of our film as well. He has an incredible story. He was the bartender there pretty much, I guess he arrived around 1975 and was there almost through the end. And we filmed him at the very bar where he worked for all those years. And he talks a little bit about sex and drug use. If you'd like to roll that clip, that would be interesting.
Yeah, and just, yes, thank you very much for that, Mark. And it's an important part for people sort of understand that everything that we've been hearing so far is obviously describing it, but there was also a lot of stuff that was going on inside. And so I think that Michael's testimony to this is really very, very important. So Emery, on my list, that's number 4, but I don't care with them.
Nope. That must be the one. I didn't label it, I guess. Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay. That's it.
We were coming out of the 60s, the 70s and disco era popped in phase of free love, and there was very much a part of that. And here, especially in the 70s and up through the early 80s, cocaine was the thing. And so in that regards, this was a place where people could let their hair down, and they did that in many different ways. Can't you see? Love's the drug for me. It was not uncommon for somebody to come in and put whatever cocaine they had on the bar. I'd have a thing of straws here, and we would just take from the pile as it went along and went back to serving drugs. Serving drinks.
The alternative, you know, everybody's favorite, crystal meth. First it was fun, then it was fun with problems, and then it was just problems. But during that time, during the 80s, it made me feel normal.
Just a little sample.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, that's just a little sample. You know,
I have to.
It's kind of interesting that some of the people I talked to said who have actually watched the whole cut, they were shocked that was going on there. And one guy told me that he would often take his his managers from his work, and they'd be in suits. And if he ever found out that drugs were going on in that place, he would have never done that. But I guess people can be shocked or not see what they don't want to see, possibly.
Yes, yes, and any situation today with large groups of people can ignore what's right there in front of them at any time. And of course, I'm sure we're a certain set of expectations about it. Lloyd, you wanted to jump in there and say something after that clip.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know where the term designer drugs came from, but during the 70s and 80s, there were synthetic drugs being tested out for the first time, MDMA, there were Quaaludes, there were all of these sort of party drugs that people referred to. They were still kept very quiet, but amyl nitrate, poppers, there was a whole thing that we'd talk about in this. Poppers were a big part of the community use for a long time. And it was very controversial in the 70s and 80s, especially with the advent of AIDS. But it was a very big part of the clientele of Studio One, because the latest designer drug would somehow be discovered at Studio One or Studio 54 on the East Coast. And a lot of conversations would always be about that on the dance floor around, it didn't make us a drug culture, but I think we were very susceptible, as many still closeted in the 70s and 80s, to designer drugs and drug, people who would purvey upon us. I myself went through that, and many of my friends went through it. And thank God that we all wisened up to what was happening. But that wasn't so much a Studio One thing as it was a thing of the time. But Studio One was a place where you would go and find out about the latest.
Sure.
And in the 70s, drugs were fun, I guess.
Yeah.
A little bit of innocence, possibly. And then the 80s came in, and of course, AIDS, which is a big part of our story in the 80s, came in. And rather than being fun, it was in a way to escape what people were going through. The whole last act of our film deals with the 80s and the PTSD that survivors, including me and Lloyd and all the people that appear in the film, are experiencing still. So the drugs just became a way of coping and an escape.
It was certainly a tough time and certainly changed the culture. And, we all think about that in the sense that we had the Stonewall riot in 1969. And then, Mark, you and I were talking yesterday about the idea that probably the first gay pride parade in Los Angeles was probably in 70 or 71. And so it was an opportunity in the 1970s, of course, for a lot of gay individuals to feel very powerful and sort of liberated, and there was a lot of enlightenment and empowerment in that period of time. And then that first article hit the New York Times in July of 1981, and I believe it was in Los Angeles that the second cohort was actually announced after that CDC article was printed in the Times. And so let's talk a little bit about how the bar in the organization, how it responded to the community and to what was happening. And the work we were doing on the Saint, for example, they opened in 1981. They opened 4 months after that first story hit the New York Times. And so, their timing was difficult at that time. And of course, the demand for the Saint in New York was as equal to the demand that you guys had in Los Angeles. New York had Studio 54 open, but that was not so much of it was gay, but wasn't really sort of a gay-centric bar like Studio One was or Saint was. But so they opened it in the year that stuff happened. They had their first fundraiser for the gay men's healthcare crisis in 1983, 2 years after that. So it was very early. So they must have had some sense of what was happening early on and trying to play a role. I'm sure there were business reasons about it, but that sounds a little too jaded, even as I say it. Hopefully it was a sense that people really wanted to support the community around them. There was so much heartache. There was so much that was unknown. There was so much trauma that people were having to deal with zero support, zero government support.
Well, Scott Forbes was certainly very generous in offering his facilities for all kinds of fundraisers. In fact, the very first fundraiser in LA wasn't until 1984, a year after that fundraiser, when Joan Rivers, it's often credited to Elizabeth Taylor as being the first person to really speak out and lend her name and support. But our film is kind of giving Joan Rivers her due, because she was the very first one to bravely lend her name and host a fundraiser along with Charles Nelson Riley and Sylvester. Not a single other celebrity would agree to appear.
Right.
And if you want to play the clip, you'll see that it was quite brave to do that at that time.
Exactly. That's what I'd like to do, is to see if we can see clip two now about that period of time.
The government wasn't going to do anything about it, and those of us who were in show business said, well, we can raise money. We can put on a show. And it was very difficult because nobody wanted to be associated with this disease. It was a pariah.
Everybody thought you were contagious. All the more reason to go back into the closet. This place here had a big part in that whole story.
We had fundraisers try to keep up with this rapid genocide that was starting to occur that there was no keeping up with.
Joan Rivers was the first one to really come forward and galvanize the community. We've got to do something because it was affecting her. It was affecting everybody's life.
She stepped in and organized this first benefit, which was held here with Sylvester.
You, Charles, and I did a show at Studio One.
Up until the end, she always said, you know, give me 6 gay men in the front row and I know it's going to be a good show.
Did that first show for AIDS.
Benefit for AIDS.
Before anyone did it, and I want to say thank you. And I want to
Thank
say
you.
I was asked to represent APLA at the event. It really was a fundraiser, not just for APLA, but for Shanti and Aid for AIDS.
It was a very emotional evening, and people were afraid to come. Why are you helping this thing? This is awful. You know, you're gonna get sick yourself, and it was pretty grim.
People in the business saying, don't do it, it's career suicide. It was fear. People were really outraged. Here was someone who was at one of the peaks of her career, hostessing the Tonight Show, basically saying, I'm taking a stand.
There was a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen at the event. We didn't know whether mayhem and chaos were going to ensue.
Our family received threats, and not just to my mother, but to my father and to me.
So there was an extra layer of security that I don't remember coming to any event here at Studio.
Right before the event, the threats were so big and so frightening that I was sent to school with bodyguards. It hit such a nerve. I mean, the fact that they made the decision to bring me with them the night of the fundraiser, and their feeling was, if something's going to happen, the place is going to get blown up, at least we're all there together.
That photo is actually taken at the event of Little Melissa with Joan, that black and white photo.
Yeah, it's amazing. And for those, I was just looking at the attendee list, and some of you are old enough to remember, but if you don't know, to actually see her on the set of the Tonight Show with Sylvester and Charles Nelson Riley, of course, as we mentioned Hollywood Squares, but some of you remember him as the next door neighbor on The Ghost of Mrs. Muir. And if you have not seen one of those, please find a copy of it. I'm sure you'll see one on YouTube, because it was, I mean, and these were people that, particularly for somebody like Charles Nelson Riley, it was very hard for them to be out at that time. Yeah. It was, even though it was known within the business, their orientation was something that they were putting themselves on the line.
There's something I wanted to add here, just we've not talked about it too much, but Joan Rivers in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, used to come in and do a show regularly at Studio One, like Melissa just said. She knew if she had 6 gay men in the front audience, it was going to be a good show. She would test her material out, and she'd lay her cards out, and she'd write her jokes. And she felt very warm and friendly to the gay audience, and she was the first one to give back to that. But moreover than that, we would give her people from what we called the corral, the backlot corral of performers, people who wanted to break in show business. Joan was so willing. We had people who would come in and do our Monday nights live at the backlot, and she would select from them somebody to open for her for these evenings. And they'd have talent scouts there. A lot of people got a career start because of Joan. And moreover, when Joan did this benefit, all of the stable of performers, the people, many of them not household names, but everybody gave of their time because of her. They gave of their time. If it was a small benefit, maybe they would be doing it somewhere in the Orange County AIDS Fund or the Arizona AIDS Fund Trust, whatever it was, we would all go out, give our time, we'd spend our own money to get there, we'd pay for our own sound and light people, and put on a show to raise money. And it was her leadership, if you will, of going out. And eventually the rest of Hollywood caught on to it. Elizabeth Taylor came along, her friend Rock Hudson.
Sure.
But she was the first, and she was never honored by any of LA gay organizations.
And
so,
all of the
she felt bad about that.
Yeah.
And there's always an opportunity to do something like that in the future. And so as you move forward. So we only have a few minutes left, but let me just get a few more facts out here just to be sure. So the club closed in 1993. Quickly now, why did it close? What happened?
Business was down. In fact, Michael Coates says the last few years, really in the 90s, it was just ready to close. You know, disco was definitely dead. People weren't going out. There were other bars, and it was time to go.
I always say Studio One went out when DUIs became a thing. It was the Santa Monica Boulevard, the intense scrutiny of driving under the influence sort of killed the nightclub business altogether. The 2-drink minimum or having to drink, but really it did. Getting responsible, because back in the day of the big disco, and I'm not saying we were irresponsible, I'm just saying that responsible driving and city laws, zoning permits, noise levels, all of that became a factor. And you used to have a club like that would have to have 1,000 people a night in it to keep it going. And
Sure.
Attendance would be down about 300.
Sure. And so then also with Scott, when did he pass away?
He passed away around 2000, I believe, 2004. He had a elective plastic surgery, and he didn't make it through that. I'm going to save some things for the film. I don't want to reveal everything here.
Well, that's done like a good filmmaker. So we have this film that you guys have started, and where are you in the schedule here? First of all, when will we be able to see the full film?
Good question.
Good question. Okay, so we filmed for 3 days in the original building in October, and then we filmed the incredible Back to the Backlot event. That was just, so many people came, so many memories, and that's a big part of the film. That's the last chapter. And we filmed a few extra days in January, and then the pandemic hit. And obviously we couldn't be shooting interviews for a long time. That's part of our film. The pandemic is a whole section. It sort of just breaks like it did for our film. And interestingly enough, I know we don't have much time, but you know, it's been there, done that. COVID-19 pandemic, our pandemic, you know, it's similar and very different in other ways, but so we kind of contrast that. So what we need to do, I have been shooting on my own. We have very limited funds, so we couldn't hire an entire crew, but I have shot like 5 or 6 days, solo interviews very safely, you know, just one-on-one, far away with masks. The subject didn't have masks. We filmed Thelma Houston, Sam Harris, Michael Solomon, the original partner, and several others. But pretty soon we should be able to really start rocking and rolling again and finish what we need to finish. And there's quite a bit still to shoot. It's sort of been evolving in the editing process. The one good thing about the pandemic is I was able to focus in for 3 weeks, and I have a 90-minute kind of work in progress cut. And kind of have been, you know, taking our time with it because we've been forced to, and possibly that's a blessing. My hope, I know it says on the trailer, coming soon, May, that's not going to happen. But my hope is by August or September, yeah, fall. We need to raise funds. I'm going to be kind of out of it for a few weeks with some issues, but we're going to start rolling again probably around May or June. And assuming we get our funding.
hopefully by the fall it will be there. And so do you imagine that this will be something that will be sent off to independent film festivals once we get?
Yes.
Is that the goal for
it? We have submitted to the Frameline completion fund. We should be hearing from that in a week or two. But absolutely we'll do the festival circuit, and our big dream is to get a Netflix deal or one of the streaming services. And I think it has a good chance. People who watch the 90-minute cut are in a puddle of tears by the end. You know,
because America is hooked on the streaming services now, and so looking for more content. And so for those of you who are interested, there is a link. It's been going up here, and so please feel free to make a contribution there. They have set up the funding for the film through a non-profit so that your support of it will actually be tax deductible as well too. And so I think that is very important. We very much look forward to being able to showcase it when the film comes out. And everybody should remember that this talk and discussion about it will be archived on our website. People can actually see it on the website as soon as tomorrow or the next day. They get posted very fast up there. So there's more information about that as well too. So it always is the way, but we've really just sort of scratched the surface here. It's a big story. It covers a big period of time. And I think what's interesting is that the challenge is really for all of us now looking forward. And I think for both of you guys and your entire team, I just want to congratulate you for the work that you're doing and how you're sort of recognizing history and understanding things without any shame about the idea of, yes, there was discrimination. Yes, there may have been drug use, but those are not the important thing. We can do things about those today. I mean, we can support young Black trans kids today because we are in a different situation. And through opportunities like this, you get to use this to actually be educational and to have things really work in this way. And so I just want to say both to you, Marc and Lloyd, thank you so much for your time and for sharing the story. People, and your website again is what, sorry?
My website is my name, marcsaltarelli.com. And if you go there, you can find the website to our GoFundMe, which is not tax deductible, and the Film Collaborative. I want to thank you, Hunter and Emery, for offering us this opportunity. We really appreciate it. And thank you for the work you do with your archive. I know how difficult nonprofits are to manage. Thank you.
Oh, very happy to do it. And again, everybody, I'm Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives. Visit us at stonewall-museum.org. Next week, we open up The Saint. This is sort of a preview of all the work that we've been doing on that exhibition. So we're happy to be talking to people, a continent away about this. Emery Grant, say hello to everybody or goodbye. You're back there someplace.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. This was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was really a
Everybody
pleasure.
stay safe. I've got my first shot. I'm looking for my second shot. So if anybody's got an extra one, if you just send it over here, I'll leave the door open. Anyway, good night, everybody. See you all soon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Good night.